Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
Terry woke up and looked at the clock. "Oh no," he groaned. "Time to get up already." Then he remembered. There was no school today. He could lay back on his pillow and tried to figure out how he should feel about classes being canceled. There were no classes because of Mrs. Stowe's funeral. She had been the 5th grade teacher, Terry's teacher. And a couple of days ago, she had been found dead in her home. Murdered. Terry stared at the ceiling. His ex-teacher had always seemed to pick on him, and they had developed a mutual dislike for each other over the year. In fact, the day before she died, the same day he found Midnight, he had been so mad at her that he wished something would happen to her. She had embarrassed him in front of the whole class. When she found out he hadn't done the homework assignment, she made him come up to the blackboard while she instructed him to write the assignment, as if he were a 2nd grader. He was so mad he had wanted to scream. When he heard something had happened to her, he felt guilty. He had never wished she would get murdered, that was for sure. A flying object landed on Terry's stomach. "Hey," he yelled. "Midnight, you stupid cat." Midnight looked up at Terry from her landing pad and began to purr. She had found Terry nearly a week ago. He had been walking home from school when out of nowhere Midnight appeared. She ran right up to him and started rubbing against his leg. He examined her and she looked pretty healthy, but there was no identifying collar. He played with her for a bit, and when he came home, she followed. He named her Midnight because her fur was the deepest, darkest black he had ever seen. His mother came into the room. "Don't forget we're going to Mrs. Stowe's funeral today, Terry." "Come on, Mom, how could I forget that?" His mother smiled. "You'd find a way. Now hurry up, Scott'll be here soon." Most of the 5th grade class was at the funeral. Terry made sure to stand with Scott, who was his best friend. "This is pretty weird," Scott whispered halfway through the ceremony. "I mean, who would have thought to kill Mrs. Stowe?" Terry nodded. "I know," he whispered back. "It's not like she was my favorite teacher or anything, but geez." Scott continued. "I heard she was hacked up into little pieces." "Who told you that?" Terry demanded. "Shh!" Terry's mother hushed him before he got the answer, and he turned forward. The minister gave a long speech about Mrs. Stowe's dedication to her students. He was followed by Mr. Keller, the school principal. Terry tried not to fidget, but he really wanted to know more about what Scott had said. After the funeral, the kids piled back into their parents' cars. Terry talked his mom into letting him and Scott walk back to the house together. "What did you mean when you said she got all hacked up?" Terry asked as soon as his mother was out of earshot. Ryan heard his dad talking about it. He said she was torn apart. It was possible, Terry thought. After all, Ryan's dad was a policeman. Do they have any idea who did it? Ryan says they don't have a clue. They reached Terry's house and spent the rest of the morning reading comic books. Scott had to go home at lunchtime to watch his little brother. Terry flipped on the television and sat on the couch. Soon, Midnight came into the room and curled up against his leg. He wondered about Mrs. Stowe. How strong would a person have to be to actually tear a human body apart? He shivered. No matter how stupid she made him feel, he would never have wished that on her. No, that kind of punishment had to be reserved for people who really deserved it. Like Howard, the school bully. Terry grunted. All the kids hated Howard. He was the biggest kid in 6th grade and he beat up on everybody. Once he had sent Terry home with a cut lip, and Terry had been too frightened to tell his parents what had really happened. He told them he had fallen on the playground. Yeah, he thought with a nod of his head. Howard was a person who deserved to be torn to shreds. The next day was school as usual, but when Terry got there, the playground was buzzing with excitement. Scott ran over to him as soon as he saw him. "You're not going to believe this," Scott practically yelled. He had a wild look and his voice sounded shaky. "What?" "You know they think Mrs. Stowe was murdered?" Terry nodded. "Well, guess who the latest victim was?" Scott waited for effect, then practically shrieked. "Howard!" Terry felt a chill creep over his skin, as if some unseen hand were plucking at his arm hairs. "Howard?" he asked in a low voice. "Are you serious?" Scott nodded like his head would fall off. I know, I didn't believe it either. But he didn't show up for class this morning, and then Mr. Keller came by and made the announcement that Howard had been found dead." "Did he say how?" asked Terry in a daze. Scott frowned. Of course not. But by the end of school, word had filtered through the playground grapevine that Howard's throat had been slashed. Terry listened to each new detail with increasing panic. He had trouble concentrating during class and was almost surprised when the bell rang at the end of the day. Terry caught a ride home with Scott's mother, and when he got there, he practically ran inside. He slammed the door behind him and dove onto the couch. Was it possible? No, it couldn't be. He buried his head in his hands and tried to convince himself that he had nothing to do with Howard's or Mrs. Stowe's deaths. His mind was racing. He couldn't help thinking about a television movie he saw once, about a man who had trouble with his memory, and at the end of the movie, the man found out that during his blackouts he had been killing people. Is that what's happening to me? Terry wondered out loud. No, that was impossible. How could he have gotten to Mrs. Stowe's house? She lived on the other side of the town. And how could he have done what Ryan's father had said was done to her body? And as for Howard, sure, he had just been thinking that it was Howard's turn for some punishment, but there was no way he could have done anything about it. It had to be coincidence, Terry finally convinced himself. He felt a little better after that and went to his room to do his homework. The rest of the month passed uneventfully. Terry's mother left town to help with her sister, who was in the hospital. Terry slowly forgot about his suspicions that he was a deranged killer who unconsciously murdered everybody he didn't like. Instead, he started to think about Diane's birthday party at the end of the month. The entire 5th grade class was going, and it was shaping up to be the event of the semester. The Friday before the party, everyone was making plans to meet the next day. Terry got home and did his homework so he wouldn't have to worry about it over the weekend. Then, because his dad still hadn't come home, he made himself a sandwich to snack on. Midnight came strolling in, and Terry chased her around the kitchen. Then she darted into the living room and began racing around with Terry in hot pursuit. Suddenly, she tore down the hall, and when Terry jumped after her, he crashed against the corner of his dad's display case. He yelled and stumbled to the floor. Then his blood chilled as he heard the sounds of breaking glass. He slowly turned to look. The display case stood on 4 thin legs with 2 glass doors. Inside was his father's collection of old camera equipment. Now the case lay toppled over, and Terry knew with a sick feeling what he would find when he stood up. Sure enough, the glass doors had broken when the ancient projector had fallen against them. What Terry didn't know was whether or not he had ruined the cameras and projector as well. He cleaned up the mess as best he could and waited in agony until his father came home. His father noticed the damage the minute he walked in. What happened here?" he asked in a disturbingly quiet voice. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was chasing Midnight and I tripped and fell against the case. It was an accident." His father didn't say anything right away, but walked over to inspect his collection. Then he turned to Terry. "You know better than that." Terry hung his head. That was the worst part. He did know he wasn't supposed to run around the living room. "Yes," he admitted. His father nodded and studied the shattered glass doors. "Well, I'm going to have to go and get some glass cut tomorrow. Then I'll see if I can rehang these doors. And I think while I'm out, that would be a perfect time for you to sit quietly and think about why I make rules about what you should and should not be doing in the house." With dawning horror, Terry realized what his father was saying. "You mean I'm grounded?" he asked in a panic. "That's exactly what I mean." "But Dad, you can't, not tomorrow. Diane's party is tomorrow. Everyone will be there." "Not everybody," his father turned to look at him. "Because you'll be here. No arguments." Terry opened and closed his mouth silently. He could feel hot tears beginning to burn his eyes. He knew it was useless to argue, so he ran to his room and threw himself on the bed. It wasn't fair. He didn't mean to knock the stupid case down. His tears filled his eyes and ran down his cheeks. Everyone was going to the party. Why did his dad have to be so mean? Midnight came in and jumped on the bed next to him. Terry angrily shoved her away. "Get out of here, you stupid cat," he cried. "It's all your fault." Later at dinner, he tried to persuade his father to change his mind. He offered to stay home Sunday instead, or all weekend next week. But his father wouldn't budge. Terry went back to bed in a black mood and fell asleep, planning to run away. That would teach his father to not be so hateful. In the middle of the night, he heard a sound. He opened his eyes and looked around the room. Then he switched on the light at the side of the bed. Midnight had pushed the door open slightly and was backing into the room. Terry watched curiously, trying to figure out what the cat was doing. Some trick of the light made Midnight seem much bigger than usual. Then Terry realized she was dragging something with her mouth. As the cat backed further into the room, Terry saw the prize she carried. A scream ripped from his throat as he saw a bloody head. It was his father. Midnight dragged it all the way into the room and turned to look at Terry proudly. Terry kept screaming until he realized that his mother was not coming either. Then he picked up the bedside lamp and hurled it at the cat. Midnight was taken by surprise, but the lamp was pulled short at the last second by the power cord, which was wrapped around one leg of the bed. The cat jumped back and hissed at Terry. "Get away from me!" Terry screamed. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his baseball bat from behind the door and swung it at the animal. Midnight jumped aside and Terry missed. He was panting with fear and almost blinded by tears, but he was still able to see the change coming over the cat. She was growing bigger. She prowled back and forth and her tail cut through the air like a whip. And with each turn she took, her body swelled larger. Terry threw the bat at the creature and squeezed out the door, slamming it shut. He stepped in something sticky and flipped on the hall light. He was standing in the trail of blood that led from his parents' room to his bedroom door. As his mind tried to accept this information, a crashing blow shook the door in its frame. Terry jumped back and watched in terrified fascination as blow after blow hit the door. Then, with a noise like a saw blade cutting through wood, a huge black paw tore through the door. Terry backed slowly away, his mind no longer functioning. He watched the big black cat try to push its way through the hole. It now stood nearly as tall as Terry at its shoulders. Terry turned to run, There was a roar from behind him and the door splintered apart. He ducked into the bathroom and slammed the door behind him. A second later, the monster hit it from the other side. Terry clawed frantically at the bathroom window while the black cat battered at the door. Then, with a final thought that snapped his mind, he remembered that the window was barred on the outside. Numbly, he turned to face the bathroom door, just as the cat began to shoulder its way through.